Today, guys, on the podcast, The Phantom of the Opera, the third book in a trilogy of fantasy books, and of course, the weekly reveal to what magical book I have pulled down from my to-be-read shelf. All of that and more this week on A Novel Review. Hello and welcome to the Literature Podcast, A Novel Review. My name is Seamus, your host, and together we will discuss, dissect, and explore the wonderful world of literature, and the wonderful world of literature is a vast and dense jungle, so let's start making our way through, one book at a time. Hey guys, welcome back. Yeah, another week, another book. Same host, sorry, I'm still here bringing you a new book each week, and this week we are doing the third book in the Thomas Covenant Chronicles, The Power That Preserves. But before we get to that book, we always take a moment to reflect on any mantelpiece moments, something to highlight from the week past. And this last week I was actually in Paris, so I got so much good stuff from that trip. It'll probably be my mantelpiece moment for the next few weeks, so strap in for that. So I thought I'd highlight one particular moment from the trip, which was I went to Place Garnier, which, if anyone's read The Phantom of the Opera, that is the opera hall that Phantom of the Opera is set. And that was, I'd say, probably the main reason I knew about this opera hall and the main reason I was going to the opera hall. If anyone's watching on YouTube, I got a little Phantom of the Opera pin there. You probably actually can't see it from this great distance. Sorry about that. It was the main reason for going. And I remember reading the book probably 2-3 years ago now and getting this real sense of this really sort of high society, really decadent sound makes it sound like it's kind of food, but really decadent building on the inside. The internal sort of beauty that was displayed in this book just seemed really, well, I don't know how to describe it really, because, in fact, 1, 2, 3, bang, we got a picture there for those on YouTube. Basically, you walk into this hall and you immediately feel poor. Basically, you immediately feel like you are too poor to be walking in a hall and an opera hall that is this lavish and rich, and the decor is just this incredibly bright and vibrant and ornate and intricate, and it was absolutely fantastic. And you can see why the book was set there, I guess, because it is this incredibly large, beautiful sort of twisting building, and there's obviously the entire behind the scenes of the actual theatre that you don't get to see, that you don't have access to, that the Phantom haunts. And it's this incredible building, and it looks all right from the outside. It doesn't look like anything particularly special, and then you walk in and you are just completely blown away, and it just seems like this huge period of excess where appearances did really matter, and this opera hall smashed it out of the park because it was absolutely incredible. I thoroughly recommend, if anyone finds themselves in Paris, to have a visit. It does cost to go in, and it was, to be quite honest, a bit of a zoo in there. There were a lot of people. In fact, I'd say it was probably the busiest site I went to in Paris, and I'd say 99% of the people there were to take pictures of themselves with the beauty of the opera hall, which, fair enough if someone wants to take a picture, but it does get a bit chaotic in there. And interestingly, some people do get quite frustrated when their picture sort of isn't coming out the way they perhaps had envisioned, and a lot of people asking you to get out of the shot and stuff like that. So it was a good sort of laugh from that perspective to see how humanity behaves in places like that. It was a good sort of character study, a good place to actually not look at the beauty of the hall and actually sort of people watch as well. So that was another sort of plus. That was really enjoyable. But yeah, Place Garnier, thoroughly enjoyed it. Housekeeping, as always, if you would like to like and subscribe, please consider hitting the 5 stars and the subscribe button, probably around there or that side maybe, I don't know. Like, subscribe, 5-star reviews really makes my day, really makes me happy, and really makes me want to continue making the pod, so thank you. Okay, here we go. The third book in the series, the third book to round out this trilogy, the first Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, The Unbeliever, The Power That Preserves. Maybe before I start voicing my opinions on the book, I should give a brief overview of the series as a whole, for those if you're tuning in for the first time. Basically, this book is about a leper a man called Thomas Covenant who lives in our world, just our everyday world, planet Earth. And in the first book, he hits his head and wakes up in a fantasy land called the Land. Now, he is given some magical mud called Hurtloam, which magically cures him of his leprosy. And with the regaining of his senses and sort of the I don't want to say excitement that comes from that, but the shock and horror that comes from that is one of the first acts he does with this newfound sort of health is he rapes a young girl. And that's kind of like the sub-story that is always threading throughout this story, because there is, of course, a fantasy land and there's a power struggle between sort of, let's just call them the free folk, the sort of everyday people of the land, and then Lord Fowl, who is the sort of chief evil mastermind who wants to take over the land and kill everything in its path. But what I found most fascinating is how the rape scene sort of plays out and how the ripples from that spread out and sort of infiltrate and affect nearly every scene from the story going forward. And yeah, so that's sort of a very brief overview of the story in general. This particular story takes place, Lord Fowl's basically laying siege to the land, and Thomas Covenant is called back. And it's tough to explain from there, because that's basically what happens. And then it's just kind of like an all-out war from there. So I guess that's probably the worst overview I've ever given for a book, but here we are. Let's get into the series as a whole first, because what I think I found I loved most and appreciated was the fact that the books here, we've got Lord Fowl's Bane, Ill Earth War, and then Power That Preserves, all of them were incredibly different and individual stories. Not individual in that you could read them in an isolated context, but individual in that they all felt incredibly different and fresh from each other. The first one, Lord Fowl's Bane, feels very much like a traditional fantasy sort of adventure quest. And that's sort of what I got from that. Of course, there's the rape in there, which was just completely shocking to read. And I remember reading it thinking, am I reading this wrong? This book from the 70s, I'm reading about a rape scene in the 70s. It just completely blew me away. And I had no idea that's where the book was going. But other than that, it feels like pretty traditional fantasy. The second book, The Ill Earth War, feels basically like an existential horror sort of, just an existential horror story basically. And then the third book is just kind of like this all-out war of attrition, and I had no idea where the victory was going to come from, if there was even going to be a victory from this story. It was just everyone seemed beaten, everyone seemed broken, and yet there was just a war going on, and it all felt very constant. And I think while I very much enjoyed it, I think that kind of took me out from it a bit. I think there was two things that really took me out of this book. I think I read it too quickly after The Ill Earth War. The Ill Earth War was absolutely fantastic. It was a brutal book, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And because of the way I scheduled the podcast, I didn't have to, I know that, but the way I scheduled it, I wanted them to come out 1 month apart so that if anyone was listening and enjoying them, they'd sort of have that structure. But I think I got caught up in the length of them because they are quite big, and also reading Harry Potter at the same time, they're also quite big. And so I kind of had to read this book pretty much straight after finishing Ill Earth War. And Ill Earth War was just so incredibly dense and rich in its sort of exploration of Thomas Covenant as an individual and the roles of responsibility on the individual level. And it was such an incredible book that I think I would have liked more time to sort of decompress it and like almost meditate on it, think about it, and then decompress it before jumping into this book, because like I said, this book is just like a war of attrition, and it feels incredibly hopeless for a lot of it. And because it feels hopeless, I felt quite hopeless while reading it, because I was just like, I'm really tired. And all the characters in this book are really tired because they've just obviously finished the events of Ill Earth War and then gone pretty much straight into the events of this book. And it's just a war they don't think they can really win, but they're going to fight to the end. And that's how I felt as the reader. I was like, I feel incredibly defeated right now. I think I've gone into this too quickly. But that is also something that sort of made me feel connected to the text as well, paradoxically, because I felt tired and the characters felt tired, and it felt very real for that reason. So I did kind of appreciate that. But yeah, basically what I was originally saying was they all felt incredibly different there is sort of an inherent structure to them in that Thomas Covenant, of course, is not from the fantasy land and so considers it a kind of dream. And because of that, the books always finish with him waking back up in reality, our land. And so there is that sort of nice, it almost becomes comforting because you know that even though we start the books off in our land, planet Earth, he's going to hit his head or something's going to happen and he's going to wake back up in the land. And you know that by the end of the story, he's probably going to then finish his time in the land and wake back up to reality. So it is kind of like a nice bookend to all the books, and that does take place. So yeah, there is a nice structure, but the fact that there's sort of 3 different stories within these 3 stories was really interesting, and I really appreciated that as the reader. So I guess getting more now into the book itself. Thomas Covenant. Now, he's committed this act of rape. There's been, well, I've already discussed the fact that he's not going to be sort of punished for his sins in the way that he's going to be beaten or imprisoned or killed or something like that, because that would be completely defeating for the story, because if we kill him, we just don't have a story anymore, which, even though we might want him to die technically for raping an innocent young girl, it's just kind of not conducive to the story going forward. So I guess what I was looking for in this book, or what I was hoping to see, was, I don't know, some character development, some further character development. And I think he does take some responsibility for his actions, and he does seem to, it's not even taking responsibility, he seems to accept his actions more and more in this book. But his idea of accepting his actions seems to be getting angry at everyone else for not hating him for those actions, which, it's good that he's recognizing his actions were bad, but it doesn't really feel like he did much to actually mitigate those actions. He just kind of got really angry that everyone else wasn't angry at him, and it was kind of this really self-pitying narrative that I didn't enjoy. I mean, Thomas Covenant, if you've just joined, is one of the most insufferable characters I think I've ever spent time with, and that turns a lot of people off this book, because he is incredibly self-pitying and he's just insufferable. He's constantly whinging. And I guess that's kind of the main part of the story, is because he doesn't actually believe he's in a fantasy land. He just kind of thinks it's a vast dream sequence that he's experiencing. And so he doesn't want to take responsibility for something that he doesn't really think is real, but it does become quite tiring to sit through. I mean, look at the stack of books here. It's, probably on 1,200 pages worth of story here, and he is just an incredibly insufferable character, which, yeah, it turns a lot of people off. Some people say by the end, they're rooting for Lord Fowl. They want the bad guy to win, basically, because they want Thomas to lose. I never got to that stage. I always wanted the land to win, because even though Thomas is, a bit of a dick, I still want the best for the vast majority of the people. But basically, it was this self-pitying form of acceptance that, I'm kind of torn, because I'm like, at least he's kind of recognizing that he has caused some pain. Like, that's for Thomas Covenant, that is a step in the right direction. Just accepting that something he did was wrong is nice. Just taking a stance on something is nice. But the fact that it sort of came out in this self-pitying way, and being angry at everyone else for not being angry at him, kind of annoyed me a bit. And it's kind of, I guess I don't know if this was necessarily intentional or part of the story or part of what Stephan Donaldson, the writer, had envisioned, but the time differences between our land and the fantasy land actually pass in different time periods. So he sort of, in the first book, he, commits the act, whatever. At the end of the first book, he goes back to planet Earth. And then I think it's in the general story, he spends 4 weeks back in reality before he's then transported back to the land, and 40 years has passed. So it seems to be that a week in our time is a year in the land's time. So in terms of Thomas Covenant, it's only been sort of like a number of weeks while this has been going on, this entire series, whereas for everyone else, it's been many, many years. And so I guess they've had a different level of time to sort of process his actions and come to grips with them and understand them, and maybe even come to accept them for what they are. But for him, it's a very different time period. And I don't know if I enjoyed that or disliked that, because it seems that he sort of gets let off the hook a lot for these actions. Like I said, he's sort of angry that no one else is angry, but everyone else has had nearly a lifetime to process this, whereas he's only had a number of weeks. And that's not to say that, that's not to put him, get him off the hook for these acts, because I think it is still absolutely terrible what he's done, but it's the fact that he just can't accept. I don't know. I think I'm just not making sense now, because I don't really know what I want, and I think this is the chief issue with the book. At least my chief issue is I don't know, and I don't know if he can be healed from something like this. I don't know if he can be forgiven from something like this. So I guess I don't know what I'm expecting and how that's going to look like and what it's actually going to look like. And so over time, I just started, not that I ever cared for Thomas, but I started to care less and less and less about him as a character and his sort of healing process in this book, which I was quite interested to see at the start. I was like, okay, he's committed this act. This is basically like a vast thought experiment now. Let's actually explore it and see what it looks like and what it could look like. I became less and less interested in that narrative of the story and more interested in how the initial act had actually played out and how it had affected and nearly completely destroyed this entire fantasy land just from that one act. And I really liked that, just watching the consequence of actions play out and how they ripple out. Something I really loved about this book was there was this sort of one line, it is the responsibility of the living to justify the sacrifices of the dead. And it's a really nice idea of people have died in service of the land, but it's not a new trope or idea by any sense of the words, but it's really nice to sort of see in these contexts where it's people have died defending the land, so we have to make those deaths mean something by continuing to fight for their existence and what they believed in. And if they died fighting for the land and the beauty of the land and the peace of the land, then we also need to fight for the peace and the beauty of the land, because they deserve it, and it's up to us. It's up to the living to continue the stories of the dead. And I really kind of enjoyed that aspect of this novel, because a lot of people die and the whole book is basically just one long war sequence taking place in two different parts. So I really enjoyed that aspect of the book. I think the general pacing of the book was also really nice as well, because it is a time period in the story where you are wondering what's going to happen and how this story is going to progress and how the victories are going to come. And it's not really drawn out in terms of it takes weeks and months and therefore years of action to happen, but it really is just like one straight fighting battle sequence for the entire story, told in two different areas, because Thomas is in one area and then there's sort of the main capital that's under siege as well. And it's kind of these last two pockets of, it seems to be almost these last two pockets of, goodness in the land that are left for Lord Fowl to conquer, but it's just the last stand basically. And it's really nice to watch it because it is quite a big book. Some of the scenes perhaps do drag a bit, and I could have, if I was an editor, maybe cut it down a bit. I read a bit of Stephan Donaldson and his writing style, and he said whenever he writes, he just writes thousands and thousands of pages basically, and he's always told to cut them down. So that's really interesting, because I feel like I could have cut out not a huge portion of this book, but like a decent chunk to bring it down a bit. But nonetheless, it was still, it never really lost me in parts. There were certain parts, like I said, that you could have easily cut out, but they didn't detract away from the story enough to slow down my reading, if that makes sense. So I guess this being sort of the last book in the first series, I know there is a second series which I'm gonna lay off reading. I do have them over there on the shelf. I'm gonna lay off reading them for maybe a year or two. I think I just need to decompress this series. But I was looking online for sort of just trying to get people's general vibe from the series, and I saw this one question that Thomas never really takes responsibility, but would you take responsibility? And I kind of had to think about it for a minute, because for the entirety of these stories, Thomas does think it's a dream sequence. Even up until the very end of this, he thinks it's just a dream sequence. And so I guess, I don't know if that makes it harder for him to accept his actions, or if that sort of removes a level of responsibility for him, because I wouldn't take responsibility for something that I think was a dream, because if it's a dream, it's taken place in my head and I haven't actually hurt anyone. So it's a really interesting question about, like, how would you take responsibility for something like this? And I think it's really interesting because I don't know. And in this book, because we have different people narrating, we know as the reader that the fantasy land is therefore real, because we're out of the mind of Thomas Covenant. And if we're out of the mind of Thomas Covenant, we are in the mind of someone else, therefore someone real, and therefore existing, and therefore saying that the whole land is real. So someone has been hurt in this. In fact, now thousands of people have been hurt and killed from this one act of rape. So it is a really interesting question, and I don't think I have an answer if I would take responsibility for it. Like, obviously, if I did that in the real world, yes, I would 100% take responsibility for it. But in a dream, it's kind of like incredibly different. And I think it was this incredibly rich, vibrant story, and a wonderful, I wouldn't say a wonderful idea, but a really interesting idea to try explore. But yeah, I did feel a bit let down that it's just kind of like very self-pitying. It's a very self-pitying kind of end for Thomas Covenant. Maybe it gets explored more in the next 3 books, and I'm sort of jumping the gun a bit, and someone's watching this going, you got to read the next 3 to sort of get the full story. If that's the case, I apologize. But just in terms of it being sort of the end of a trilogy, I would have liked a bit more sort of personal growth and a bit of more personal responsibility from Thomas himself. But we are where we are. So yeah, what would I rate this book? The Power That Preserves. I think I rated the other 2. In fact, I think I downgraded Lord Falsbane after reading Ill-Earth War, because Ill-Earth War was an incredible book. All in all, if you're a fan of fantasy, I'd say it's definitely a worthwhile read. It does raise some interesting questions, and I think it did sort of, a lot of people say it kickstarted a lot of sort of modern fantasy because it dealt with this really dark question. And before that, fantasy was really sort of fluffy and light and airy, and it's always good versus bad. Whereas this, it's like, no, what do we do if we take the protagonist, not the main character, not the hero by any sense of the means, but just the protagonist, and make him like a pretty terrible person, but then put him on the side of the good people? What does that look like? And that's what we get in this series. So I think it's a worthwhile sort of series to read. Power That Preserves, I think, deserves a 3.8. And the series as a whole, I would say probably a 3.8 as well, actually. So pretty happy with that. Okay, so what am I reading this week? This week I am reading Shirley Jackson and the Haunting of Hill House. I have read this book before, but I wanted to read it again because the first time I read it, I was a bit sick. And so I think I kind of missed a bit of the story, but also I just love Shirley Jackson, and any excuse to read more Shirley Jackson. Love this book. This is one of my favorites. We've Always Lived in the Castle is probably my favorite of hers. The Lottery is just shocking. But yeah, that's what I'm reading. I am 74 pages in out of 250, so sizable way in. It's such a interesting story. And now the second read, I'm really sort of seeing how she has utilized sort of different scenes and language to create a tension that's sort of threading throughout the story nicely. So really keen to do an episode on that. Really keen to finish reading it first. Probably more keen to finish reading it first, but we'll get there. If you have listened this far, please consider hitting those 5 stars. I would really appreciate it. Also, feel free to head along to the website and support the pod. But as always, thank you for your attention. So I think it's time to end this episode. And today, to take us away, a bit of Homer. And this is a collection of some of the works that take place in Homer, in the Iliad. And it's called War Music by Christopher Logg. And just this little passage that takes place in the Iliad. So here we go. And God forbid I share the niceness of a man who, when his friends go down, sits tight and finds his vindication in their pain. They are dying, Achilles, dying like flies.